The knock came after dark. Out here, in the lands where the sky was too big and the ground too hard, a knock after dark meant one of two things: trouble or death. Sometimes it meant both. Nora Wren knew this. She knew it in her bones, in the grit under her fingernails, in the way the wind whispered warnings through the cracks in her cabin walls. Every coyote, every rattler, every ghost that haunted these plains knew better than to come calling after the sun had bled out behind the western mesas. But Nora Wren opened her door anyway. He didn't stumble in. He fell, a straight forward collapse like a puppet whose strings had been cut clean through. There was no bullet hole, no knife wound she could see, just a man hollowed out by the road, worn down to his very soul by dust and desperation. And he wasn't alone. Swaddled against his chest, held there by the instinct of a man already deep in unconsciousness, was a child. A baby, no more than a few days old, so small it seemed impossible it could survive out here. Its cry was a tiny, ragged tear in the fabric of the night, a sound of pure exhaustion before it fell silent again, as if even breathing was a luxury it couldn't afford. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. She dropped to her knees, her mind racing faster than a prairie fire. The man's arms were limp, yet somehow they were still wrapped just tight enough to keep the newborn from tumbling to the floorboards. He was protecting the child, even as the lights went out in his own head. First the baby. She eased the small bundle from his grasp, her calloused hands surprisingly gentle. She checked for warmth, for the telltale heat of a fever, for the steady rhythm of breath. The child was weak, but alive. A miracle. Then, the man. His pulse was a faint, thready whisper against her fingertips. Who was he? Who in God's name collapses at a stranger's door with a newborn baby? And that's when the second knock came. This one was different. Hard, official. The sound of authority. Nora froze. She looked from the unconscious man on her floor to the swaddled infant in her arms, and a cold dread washed over her. She gently placed the baby in a wooden crate by the stove, pulling a worn quilt over it. She straightened up, wiped the dust from her hands onto her trousers, and walked to the door. Standing there, silhouetted against the moonlight, was Sheriff Miller, and he wasn't alone either. 2 deputies flanked him, rifles held easy but ready across their shoulders. "Nora," the sheriff said, his voice flat. He tipped his hat back, his eyes scanning the darkness behind her. "You seen a man come this way? Answers to the name of Kane. Tall, dark hair, looks like he's been through hell and back." Nora's blood ran cold. Kane. She could feel the man's near lifeless form, just a few feet away, hidden in the shadows of her home. She could hear the baby's faint, wheezing breath. And in that moment, Nora Wren made a choice. It was a choice that would set her whole world on fire. "No," she said, her voice impossibly steady. She stood firm in the doorway, blocking the view, her body a shield. "No man's come by here." Sheriff Miller's eyes narrowed. He was a man who could smell a lie from a mile away. "You sure about that, Nora? We got word he was headed this direction. He's wanted, for questioning." "Dead sure, Sheriff," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. He held her stare for a long, heavy moment. The air crackled with unspoken threats. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "All right, Nora. If you see anything, you send word." She watched them ride off, a swirl of dust in the pale moonlight, their rifles glinting like broken promises. Only when they were gone did she shut the door, slide the heavy bolt across, and lean against it, her body trembling. She turned back to the man lying motionless on her floor. The man called Kane, and she whispered to the silent, watching shadows of her home. "Whatever this is, it better be worth it." Because the lie she just told wasn't just a lie, it was a declaration of war. To understand the choice Nora made, you have to rewind. 3 weeks earlier, she'd ridden into the dusty town of Dry Gulch alone. She was always alone. The world wasn't built for women like her. A woman who owned her own land, paid her own way, and carried a pistol on her hip like it was a part of her. The ranch was all she had left. Hard ground, dust-choked cattle, and fences that were more prayer than wood. It was hers, inherited after her father passed and her brother ran off chasing silver rumors and cheap whiskey. Nora ran it with grit and sweat, but even grit has its limits. The dry season had stretched on for too long, a thirsty beast sucking the life from the earth. 3 of her calves had died. Her only ranch hand, a wiry old-timer named Jeb, had finally given up and ridden off. Nora stood in the middle of her land, the silence pressing in on her, and faced a truth as hard as the baked soil beneath her boots. She couldn't do it alone anymore. So she did what desperate people did. She swallowed her pride and posted a notice at the stagecoach stop in town. Wanted, capable man to assist in ranch maintenance. Shelter provided, modest pay. Not seeking a husband, just help. No drunks, no thieves, no ghosts. Inquire at Northridge Ranch, 2 miles past Rattlesnake Creek. The days trickled by, empty and silent. No one came. She started to think her reputation for being hard-headed and solitary had finally scared everyone off for good. Then, a reply appeared, tucked under a rock by her front gate. Not a letter delivered by the post, but placed there by hand, in secret. It was a single piece of folded paper, the handwriting lean and clean, too elegant for a typical ranch hand. I am no stranger to work. I don't drink. I don't steal. Ghosts, though. I reckon they follow me whether I want them to or not. If that ain't disqualifying, I'll be there by month's end. C. Just a single initial. C. Something about the tone struck her. It was honest, wounded, and defiant. She felt a strange kinship with the words on the page. She understood what it meant to be haunted. She left the back door unlatched on the 29th day. He never came. She forgot about it, chalked it up to another broken promise in a world full of them. And then came the knock. Then came the collapse. Then came the man whose pulse was fading on her floor. The man called Kane. His fever broke 3 days later. He woke up to the smell of boiled oats and the sight of sunbeams slicing through the dusty air of her spare room. Nora was sitting in a chair by the window, cleaning her rifle, the quiet clicks of the mechanism filling the silence. His first words weren't, "Thank you." They weren't, "Where am I?" They were a raw, desperate rasp. "Where is she?" Nora didn't look up from her work. She just nodded her head toward the wooden crate by the stove. The baby, whose name she still didn't know, was sleeping soundly, wrapped in one of her late mother's quilts. The child's cheeks had a touch of pink now, a sign of life returning. "She's fine," Nora said. "She made it." The man, Kane, stared at the infant. He didn't cry, he didn't smile, he just looked at the sleeping child like he was seeing a promise he never, ever expected to be kept. He gave a single, slow nod of gratitude, and then he passed out again. The days that followed were a quiet, careful dance. Kane, as he slowly regained his strength, never said more than he had to. He ate what was given, slept in short, restless bursts, and watched Nora with eyes that held 1,000 secrets. But he worked. Without being asked, he repaired the section of fence that had been bothering her for months. He split a week's worth of firewood and stacked it neatly by the porch. He moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of a life of hard labor. And the way he held his daughter, Nora had never seen anything like it. There was no softness in Kane. He was a man made of leather and smoke, of sharp edges and hard miles. But when he held that child, he held her like she was spun from moonlight and whispers, the most fragile, precious thing in the entire world. Still, the questions piled up in Nora's mind like stones. Why the fever? Why was the sheriff looking for him? Why was he on the run? She didn't ask. Not yet. She knew a cornered animal when she saw one. But then she found the letter. She hadn't meant to snoop. Kane was still weak, sleeping most of the day, and his saddlebag had fallen open when she moved it from the corner. Tucked inside a torn leather lining was a letter. The edges were frayed, The paper softened from being read and reread countless times. It wasn't addressed to him. It was written by him, to a woman named Eliza. I know I can't fix what I broke. I know leaving means I lose my claim, my name, my place in this world. But I will not let them have her. I will not let our daughter become some man's property, a debt to be paid. I will run. I will hide. I will cross 1,000 miles of hell if I have to. But I will not lose our little hope. The ink was splotched in places, as if the hand that wrote it was trembling. Hope. That was the baby's name. And the letter confirmed Nora's deepest fear. Cain hadn't just been running from the law. He was running from something far more powerful. People who wanted to take his child. That night, Nora stood by the makeshift crib for a long time, watching the baby sleep. The quiet rhythm of the house felt different now. It wasn't just her home anymore. It was a sanctuary, a fortress, and a target. She had lied to the sheriff. She had taken in a fugitive. She had tied her fate to a man she didn't know and a child who wasn't hers. The storm Cain had brought to her doorstep was no longer on the horizon. It was here. And when it broke, it wouldn't just take him. It would take her too. The quiet didn't last. A week after Cain started walking again, a buggy rolled up Nora's long, dusty drive. It wasn't the sheriff this time. This buggy was fancy, lacquered black, pulled by two perfectly matched gray horses. The man driving it was dressed in a fine wool suit that looked completely out of place in the rugged landscape. He smelled of banker's ink and expensive cigars. He didn't knock. He stood by his buggy and called out Nora's name as if he owned the place. Cain was in the barn, mending a harness. He froze, his hand tightening around the awl. Nora saw the look on his face, not just fear, but a deep, weary resignation. He knew who this was. Nora walked out onto the porch, her rifle held loosely in one hand. Something I can help you with? The man in the suit gave a thin, unpleasant smile. I'm looking for a man named Cain. He owes a considerable debt to my employer. He works for me, Nora said, her voice like flint. He's working off his keep. You want money, you can ride on. The man's smile widened, but it didn't reach his cold eyes. Oh, it's not about the money anymore. It's about the principle of the matter. And it's about what he took. Just then, the baby, Hope, let out a small cry from inside the house. The man's eyes flickered toward the sound, and his smile turned predatory. Ah, he said softly, so that's where she is. Cain stepped out of the barn then, moving to stand beside Nora. He was unarmed, but he stood tall, his body a shield between the man and the house. You're not touching her, Blackwood. Blackwood. The name sounded like a curse. That's not your decision to make, Cain, Blackwood said smoothly. Eliza's family, the McLennans, have filed a legal claim. They have been granted custody of the child. They say you're an unfit father, a debtor, a fugitive who abandoned his responsibilities. What I did, Cain's voice was low and shaking with rage, was try to save my wife. What I'm doing is protecting my daughter. Blackwood chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. You call this protection? Hiding out on some godforsaken ranch with a woman who looks like she'd rather shoot you than speak to you? The McLennans can give the child a life of wealth, of privilege. They'll give her a cage, Cain spat. The law is the law, Blackwood said, pulling a folded document from his coat. I have the papers right here. I've come to collect the asset. He called the baby an asset. Something inside Nora snapped. This is my land, she said, and her voice was so cold and hard it could have chipped stone. She raised the rifle, not pointing it at him, but holding it in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. And everything on it is under my protection. The only asset you'll be collecting today is a face full of dirt if you take one more step. Now get off my property. Blackwood stared at her, genuinely surprised. He had expected the broken man. He hadn't expected the iron-willed woman. He looked from Nora's unblinking eyes to the rifle in her hands, then back to Cain's defiant stance. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Very well," he said, his voice laced with venom. "You can have your little fortress for now, but the McLennans are powerful people. They don't give up, and neither do I." He climbed back into his buggy, turned the horses around, and rolled away, leaving a cloud of dust and the heavy weight of his threat hanging in the air. Kane finally let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He turned to Nora, his face a mixture of gratitude and despair. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Nora said, her eyes still fixed on the disappearing buggy. "I did." But as she watched the dust settle, a new, chilling thought entered her mind. Blackwood had mentioned the McLennans, Eliza's family, but he'd said he worked for an employer. He'd spoken of a debt. This wasn't just about a custody battle. There was someone else in the shadows, another player in this deadly game. And Nora had just painted a target on her own back. The threat from Blackwood changed the air on the ranch. It was no longer a quiet refuge. It was a stronghold waiting for a siege. Every snap of a twig, every shadow that danced in the wind felt like a prelude to an attack. Kane worked with a new frantic energy. He reinforced the barn door, checked the latches on every window, and started sleeping on the floor by the front door, a heavy iron poker by his side. He was no longer just a man trying to survive. He was a soldier defending his last patch of ground. Nora watched him, her own resolve hardening with every passing day. She had spent her life building walls around her heart, trusting no one but herself. Now, she had let two strangers inside those walls, and their danger had become hers. She found herself listening for the sound of Hope's soft coos in the morning. She found herself watching Kane as he patiently carved a small wooden bird for the baby, his large, calloused hands moving with surprising tenderness. A strange, unfamiliar feeling began to take root in her chest. It felt dangerously like hope. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of the kitchen, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the baby's gentle breathing, Nora finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "The McLennans want the baby," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. "Blackwood is working for someone else, the one you owe money to." "Who is he?" Kane stared into the fire, his face grim. "His name is Silas, and he's not just a loan shark, he's the man who was supposed to marry Eliza." Nora's head snapped up. This was a twist she hadn't seen coming. "The McLennans arranged it," Kane continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Silas was from a wealthy family. It was a good match on paper. But Eliza, she didn't love him. She met me, a simple cattleman with nothing to my name but a bit of land and a lot of debt. And she chose me." He finally looked at Nora, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it was bottomless. "Silas never forgave her, or me. When Eliza got sick after we married, I was desperate. The doctors cost a fortune. I sold my cattle, mortgaged my land, and when that wasn't enough, I went to Silas." "You borrowed money from him?" Nora breathed. "He was the only one who would give it," Kane said with a bitter laugh. "He made me beg. He knew I was trapped. I signed his papers, promising him everything if I couldn't pay it back. I thought I'd have time. I thought Eliza would get better." His voice broke. She didn't. She died a few days after Hope was born. The day of the funeral, Silas came to my ranch. Not with condolences. He came with Blackwood and a handful of hired guns. He came to collect. "He wanted the ranch?" Kane shook his head slowly. "He wanted to destroy everything Eliza had ever loved. He wanted to see me broken. He wanted to take my home, my land, and my daughter. He said she was part of the debt." A cold fury unlike anything she had ever known rose in Nora. "So you ran." "I had to," Kane said, his voice ragged. "That night, before they could take her, I set fire to the homestead. I burned it all to the ground. If I couldn't have it, neither could he. I grabbed Hope and just ran. I didn't stop until I collapsed on your doorstep." Now it all made sense. The desperation, the fear, the protective shell he had built around himself and his child. He wasn't just running from debt. He was running from a monster, a man driven by jealousy and vengeance, and that monster now knew where to find him. Nora stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the oppressive darkness. "He's not just going to send Blackwood next time, is he?" "No," Kane said, his voice heavy with certainty. "Next time, Silas will come himself, and he won't leave empty-handed." Nora turned back from the window, her face set like stone. For the first time, she looked at Kane not as a fugitive or a burden, but as an ally, a partner in a war she had unknowingly joined. "Then we'd better be ready," she said. But a new chilling thought snaked its way into her mind. Kane had burned his ranch to keep it from Silas. But what had he really been destroying? Was it just a house? Or was he trying to burn a secret, too? The feeling that she didn't have the whole story was stronger than ever. And she had a sinking feeling that the next time trouble came knocking, it would be to burn her world down, too. They didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody streaks across the sky, they saw the riders. Not one or two, but a group of 5, cresting the ridge to the south. They moved slowly, deliberately, their dark shapes silhouetted against the dying light like harbingers of doom. At the head of the group was a man on a powerful black stallion. Even from a distance, Nora could feel the menace radiating from him. He rode with an arrogant stillness, a predator who knew his prey was cornered. "It's him," Kane whispered, his hand instinctively going to the small wooden bird in his pocket. "It's Silas." Nora didn't waste time with words. "Get Hope. Take her to the cellar. Bar the door from the inside. Don't come out, no matter what you hear. Nora, I can't let you face them alone." "This is my land," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. She grabbed her rifle from its place over the mantelpiece. "They want to fight, they'll get one. But they're not getting their hands on that child. Now go." Kane hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes locking with hers. In that shared glance, 100 unspoken things passed between them. Gratitude, fear, a shared resolve that was as strong as steel. Then he nodded, scooped the sleeping baby from her makeshift crib, and disappeared through the trapdoor in the pantry. Nora heard the heavy bolt slide into place below. She was alone, just like she'd always been. But this time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She took her position by the front window, using the heavy curtain as cover. The 5 riders had stopped at her front gate, a good 100 yards away. They weren't rushing. They were enjoying this. Silas dismounted, his fine leather boots kicking up puffs of dust. He was flanked by Blackwood and 3 other men, rough-looking types with guns strapped to their hips. "Nora Wren!" Silas's voice boomed across the clearing, dripping with false pleasantry. "We know he's in there. Send out the debtor and the child, and we will leave you and your pathetic little ranch in peace." Nora's heart pounded, but her hands were steady on the rifle. She said nothing. "Let them sweat. Don't be foolish, woman," Blackwood shouted. "There are 5 of us. You can't win." Silence was her only answer. Silas chuckled. It was a sound that made Nora's skin crawl. "Very well. Have it your way." He turned to one of his men. "Burn the barn." The man grinned, pulling a torch from his saddlebag. He lit it, the flame sputtering to life in the twilight. Nora's stomach clenched. The barn was her livelihood. It housed her tools, her meager supply of hay, her 2 milk cows. But it wasn't the house. It wasn't the cellar. She watched as the man tossed the torch onto the dry roof of the barn. The old wood caught instantly, flames licking up the sides with a hungry roar. Still, she didn't move. She didn't make a sound. This was a test of her will. Silas was watching the house, waiting for her to panic, to run out, to surrender. But Nora Wren didn't run. As the flames from the barn painted the sky orange and red, she raised her rifle, took careful aim at the man standing next to Silas, Blackwood, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the evening air, sharp and clean. Blackwood cried out and crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg. It wasn't a killing shot. It was a message. You want war? You've got it. Silas stared at the house, his face a mask of pure fury. The game was over. The siege had begun. He barked an order, and his men scattered, taking cover behind rocks and the old water trough. Gunfire erupted, bullets thudding into the wooden walls of Nora's cabin, splintering the frame around the window. Nora dropped to the floor, crawling from window to window, firing sparingly, making every shot count. She wasn't an army. She couldn't afford to waste ammunition. She just needed to hold them off, to survive until dawn. But as the hours dragged on, and the fire from her burning barn cast dancing, demonic shadows all around her, a terrible thought crept into her mind. What if Cain had been wrong? What if Silas wasn't just after the baby as a form of revenge? The way Blackwood had called Hope an asset, the way the McLennans, a powerful family, were involved, it didn't add up. There had to be something more, something valuable. And then she remembered the letter she'd found, the one Cain had written to Eliza. I will not let them have her. I will not let our daughter become some man's property, a debt to be paid. Property. What if Hope wasn't just a child? What if she was the key to something? An inheritance, a claim to land? The chilling realization hit her like a physical blow. They didn't want to hurt the baby. They needed her, alive. And that made them infinitely more dangerous. Because they wouldn't stop. They would do anything, burn anything, kill anyone who stood in their way, including her. As another volley of bullets ripped through her wall, Nora knew she couldn't win a war of attrition. She had to do something drastic, something they would never expect. She looked at the roaring fire of her barn, at the smoke and embers filling the night sky, and she got an idea. A terrible, reckless, and possibly brilliant idea. The fire was a weapon. Silas and his men were using it to smoke her out, to terrorize her. But they had made a critical mistake. They had underestimated the woman inside the cabin, and they had given her the one thing she needed, a distraction. Under the cover of the smoke and the crackle of the flames, Nora moved. She crawled to the back of the cabin, to a small boarded-up window she hadn't opened in years. It was a tight squeeze, but she was wiry and strong. She worked the boards loose with the butt of her pistol, prying them away with a low groan of protesting wood. She slipped out into the darkness, the heat from the burning barn washing over her in a suffocating wave. The air was thick with smoke, stinging her eyes and choking her lungs. Silas's men were all focused on the front of the house, firing intermittently, waiting for her to break. They never thought she would leave her fortress. She moved like a ghost through the shadows, circling around the perimeter of her own property. Her target wasn't the men. It was their horses. A man on foot in this country was a dead man. She reached the spot where they had tethered their mounts, a small copse of trees a safe distance from the firefight. The animals were skittish, their eyes wide with fear from the fire and the sound of gunfire. Nora whispered soothingly to them, her voice a low murmur. She was good with animals. They trusted her in a way people never did. She moved quickly, her knife flashing in the firelight as she sliced through the reins of 4 of the horses. She slapped their rumps hard, sending them galloping off into the night, their panicked whinnies fading into the distance. She left one horse, the big black stallion, Silas's horse. Then she crept back toward the house, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The most dangerous part of her plan was yet to come. She took a deep breath, raised her pistol, and fired 2 shots into the air from the side of the house. "He's out!" one of the men yelled. "He's trying to flank us." It was the bait, and they took it. 2 of the men broke cover, running toward the sound of her shots, their guns drawn. They were expecting to corner Cain. They ran right into Nora. She stepped out from behind the rain barrel, a wraith emerging from the smoke. She fired once. The first man went down with a cry, clutching his shoulder. The second man froze, his eyes wide with shock. He had a clear shot, but he hesitated for a fatal second. Nora didn't hesitate. Her second shot was true. The man dropped like a stone. 2 down. Silas, hearing the commotion, roared in fury. "What's happening? Blackwood, report!" But Blackwood was still on the ground, groaning in pain. The last remaining gunman was pinned down, unsure of where the attack was coming from. This was her chance. Nora didn't run back to the cabin. She ran for the stallion. She vaulted into the saddle, a lifetime of riding making the movement as natural as breathing. She grabbed the remaining reins and dug her heels into the horse's flanks. The powerful animal surged forward, not away from the fight, but straight toward it. She galloped past the front of her own house, a wild, terrifying figure emerging from the smoke and flames, her hair flying behind her, the pistol still hot in her hand. Silas and his last man stared, dumbfounded. This was impossible. This wasn't part of the plan. Nora rode straight for them. She didn't slow down. The gunman raised his rifle, but he was panicked. His shot went wide, whistling past her ear. Nora didn't even flinch. She rode past him, leaning down low and smashing the barrel of her pistol against the side of his head. He crumpled without a sound. 3 down. Now it was just her and Silas. He stood alone in the firelight, his face a twisted mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. He drew his own pistol, a fancy silver-inlaid weapon. But Nora didn't stop. She rode the stallion straight at him. He fired. The bullet grazed her arm, a hot, searing pain. She ignored it. She wasn't trying to shoot him. She wasn't trying to capture him. She was just trying to get to the house. She galloped past him so close he could have reached out and touched her, and reined the stallion to a skidding halt at the front door of her cabin. She leaped from the saddle, leaving the horse to rear and whinny in confusion. She slammed the door shut, slid the bolt, and collapsed against it, her body screaming with pain and adrenaline. Outside, Silas was roaring, a sound of pure, thwarted fury. He was alone. His men were down. His horses were gone. He was stranded. But he was still alive, and he was still dangerous. Nora pushed herself up, grabbing her rifle. She peeked through the window. Silas was limping toward his wounded men, dragging Blackwood toward the cover of the water trough. The siege wasn't over, but she had evened the odds. She leaned her head against the cool wood of the wall, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The smell of smoke, gunpowder, and blood filled the air. Her arm was on fire, and her barn, her life's work, was nothing but a pile of glowing embers. She heard a faint scratching from the floor. "Nora!" Kane's voice was a muffled, desperate whisper from the cellar. "Nora, are you all right?" She slid down to the floor, her back against the trap door. "I'm all right," she whispered back, her voice hoarse, "just catching my breath." But as she looked around her small, bullet-riddled cabin, a new and terrible question began to form in her mind. She had survived the night. But what about the day? And what other secrets was Kane still keeping from her? The fight with Silas felt too personal, too vicious to just be about alone. And why would the McLennans, a family of wealthy landowners, be so desperate to get their hands on one illegitimate grandchild? She had won the battle. But she had a sinking feeling she was still losing the war. Dawn broke over a landscape of devastation. The sun rose on the smoldering skeleton of Nora's barn, on the still forms of the men she had shot, and on the bullet-pocked walls of her cabin. The air was cold and smelled of ash. Inside, the silence was heavy. Nora sat at her kitchen table, her sleeve rolled up, clumsily bandaging the gunshot wound on her arm. It was a deep graze, bleeding sluggishly, but the bullet had passed clean through. She was lucky. She heard the bolt on the trap door slide back, and Kane emerged from the cellar. He took one look at the scene, the shattered window, the bullet holes, Nora's bloodied arm, and his face went pale. Hope was cradled in his arms, awake now, her wide, innocent eyes taking in the destruction. "Nora," he breathed, his voice filled with guilt. I should have been up here." "You were where you needed to be," Nora said, her voice flat. She finished tying the bandage, her fingers clumsy. "Protecting her." Kane looked out the window at the carnage in his front yard. Silas and the wounded Blackwood were gone. They must have slipped away in the pre-dawn light, taking the one conscious gunman with them. They had left the dead behind. "They'll be back," Kane said. It wasn't a question. "I know." He set Hope down gently in her crate and came over to the table. He looked at Nora's arm, his brow furrowed with concern. "Let me see that." His touch was gentle as he examined her handiwork. For a man whose life was defined by hardness, his hands were surprisingly soft. "You're a terrible doctor," he said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "I'm a better shot," she replied without humor. He found some clean rags and a bottle of whiskey and set about cleaning and redressing the wound properly. They worked in silence, the unspoken tension thick between them. Finally, Nora couldn't hold it in any longer. "You didn't tell me everything, Kane." He stopped what he was doing, his eyes fixed on the bandage. "I told you what you needed to know." "No," she said, her voice sharp. "You told me a story, a desperate man running from a loan, a custody battle with a rich family. But last night, that wasn't about money, that was about hatred. Silas wanted to burn this place to the ground with all of us in it. Why? Why is he so obsessed with you? And why are the McLennans so desperate to get Hope?" Kane was silent for a long time. He finished tying the new bandage, his movements slow and deliberate. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Because Hope," he said finally, his voice so low she could barely hear it, "isn't just a McLennan. She's the only McLennan." Nora stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about? Eliza had a family." "She had parents," Kane corrected. "Old man McLennan and his wife. They never had any other children. Their entire fortune, their land, their name. It was all supposed to pass to Eliza, and then to her children." The pieces started to click into place in Nora's mind, forming a picture that was darker and more twisted than she could have imagined. "And Eliza is gone," Nora whispered. "Yes," Kane said, finally looking up. His eyes were haunted. "And her parents, they died a month ago. A fever swept through their ranch. They were both gone in a week." Nora's blood ran cold. "So, Hope inherits everything," Kane finished for her. "The entire McLennan estate, a fortune in land and cattle that makes this little ranch look like a postage stamp. According to old man McLennan's will, his entire legacy passes to his daughter's firstborn child." It all made a sickening kind of sense now. Hope wasn't just a baby. She was an heiress, a pawn in a game for a massive fortune. "And the McLennans don't have a legal claim?" Nora asked. "Not a direct one," Kane said. "The will is ironclad. It all goes to Hope. But there's a clause. If the child's legal guardian is deemed unfit or is unable to provide care, the estate is to be managed by a trustee until the child comes of age." "A trustee appointed by the family," Nora finished, the bitter taste of understanding in her mouth. "They don't want custody out of love. They want to control her fortune." "Exactly," Kane said. "And who do you think they would appoint as trustee? The man who was supposed to be part of the family all along. The man who has been whispering in their ears, poisoning them against me from the start. Silas. It was a conspiracy, a cold, calculated plot to steal a child's birthright. And Kane, the grieving husband, the loving father, had been painted as a villain to make it all legal. But there was still one piece that didn't fit." "The fire," Nora said, her eyes narrowing. "You said you burned your ranch down out of defiance, but that's not the whole truth, is it? You were destroying something." Kane's face tightened. He looked away, toward the window, toward the ruin of her barn. "Kane," Nora pressed, her voice hard, "I just fought a war for you on my front lawn. I've earned the truth. All of it." He took a deep, shuddering breath, a man finally ready to unburden his soul. "The fire," he said, his voice cracking. "I wasn't just destroying the ranch. I was destroying the marriage records, the family Bible, everything that proved Eliza and I were legally married." Nora stared at him, her mind reeling. "Why? Why would you do that?" "Because," he said, turning to face her, the full, devastating weight of his secret finally revealed. If we were never married, then Hope is illegitimate. And according to the law in this territory, an illegitimate child cannot inherit. He had done it to protect her. He had burned his own past, erased his own history, made his own daughter a bastard in the eyes of the world, all to keep her out of their clutches. If she couldn't inherit the fortune, they would have no reason to hunt her. He would be left alone to raise his daughter in peace. It was an act of desperate, sacrificial love. But it had failed. They had found him anyway. And now, Nora was standing in the middle of the wreckage of his last desperate plan. She looked at this broken, haunted man, and for the first time she saw him clearly. He wasn't a fugitive. He wasn't a debtor. He was a king who had burned his own kingdom to save the princess. Before she could say anything, a new sound cut through the morning air, the slow, steady beat of a single horse approaching. Nora and Kane exchanged a look of alarm. They both grabbed their rifles, moving to the window. But it wasn't Silas. It wasn't his men. It was Sheriff Miller, and he was riding alone. He stopped his horse in the middle of the yard, his eyes taking in the dead bodies, the burned-out barn, the blood on the ground. His face was a grim, unreadable mask. He dismounted slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Nora," he called out, his voice heavy. "You've got a lot of explaining to do." Nora knew this was it, the moment of truth. She could lie again, or she could trust him. But trust was a currency she was fresh out of. "Stay here," she said to Kane. "Keep the door barred." She slung her rifle over her shoulder and stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind her. She stood there, facing down the law, her bandaged arm throbbing, her face smudged with soot. The war for Hope was far from over, and it looked like a new battle was about to begin. Sheriff Miller didn't look at the dead men. He looked at Nora. He took in her bandaged arm, the grim set of her jaw, the rifle slung over her shoulder. His gaze was sharp, missing nothing. "I asked you a question a few weeks back, Nora," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I asked you if you'd seen a man named Kane. You lied to my face." "I did what I had to do," Nora said, her own voice steady. "What you had to do was tell the truth to a sworn officer of the law," Miller countered, taking a slow step forward. "Instead, you harbored a fugitive. You obstructed justice. And now, this." He finally gestured to the carnage around them. "2 men dead. Your barn burned to the ground. You're in a world of trouble, Nora." "The only trouble here," Nora shot back, "is the kind that rides up to a woman's house in the middle of the night and tries to burn her alive." The sheriff's eyes flickered. He stopped, his gaze falling on the insignia one of the dead men wore on his belt, a small, tarnished silver serpent swallowing a feather. Silas's mark. Miller's jaw tightened. "Silas," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "He came for the baby," Nora said, pressing her advantage. "He and the McLennans. They have some twisted legal claim, and they're willing to kill for it." Miller looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "I know about the McLennans' claim, and I know Silas has been sniffing around it. That's why I came looking for Kane in the first place. I wasn't trying to arrest him, Nora. I was trying to warn him." Nora stared at him, stunned into silence. This was a twist she never could have anticipated. "The McLennans are powerful," Miller continued, his voice low and serious. "They have judges in their pocket. And Silas is poison. I knew if they found Kane it wouldn't end well. I was hoping to find him first, get him and the child safely out of the territory before it came to this." He sighed, a weary sound, and ran a hand over his face. "But he ran, and you lied. And now look at the mess we're in." A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over Nora. The law wasn't her enemy. The law was complicated. "He's inside," she said finally. "He and the baby. They're safe." Miller nodded slowly. "For now. But Silas won't give up. He's been humiliated. He'll be back and he'll bring more men. You can't hold this place against an army, Nora." "I'm not giving them the child," Nora said, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. "I'm not asking you to," the sheriff said. He walked closer, stopping at the foot of her porch steps. "But we need a new plan. Hiding here isn't going to work anymore. We need to go on the offensive." "What do you mean?" "I mean, we need to prove, legally, that Kane is a fit father and that Silas and the McLennans are criminals," Miller said. "We need evidence. We need witnesses. We need to take this fight out of the shadows and into the courthouse." It sounded impossible. A lonely rancher, a wanted man, and a small-town sheriff against a wealthy family and a ruthless land baron. "How?" Nora asked, the single word filled with doubt. "Kane's story for a start," Miller said. "He needs to give me a full statement. Everything he knows about Silas, about the McLennans' dealings, and the fire at his ranch. He needs to tell me the truth about that." Nora hesitated. She looked back at the closed door of her cabin, thinking of the man inside and the terrible secret he had confessed to her. "There's something else," Miller said, his eyes narrowing again. He was a man who sensed secrets like a wolf senses fear. "Something you're not telling me. What is it, Nora?" This was it, the moment to trust, to lay all the cards on the table. "Kane burned his marriage records," she said quietly, "to make his daughter illegitimate, so she couldn't inherit the McLennan fortune. He was trying to protect her." The sheriff stood perfectly still, processing this new information. A slow, thoughtful look spread across his face. He wasn't angry. He looked impressed. "He nullified his own claim to save his daughter," Miller mused. "That's not the act of an unfit father. That's the act of a damn hero. And it might just be the key to winning this whole thing." "How?" "Because if Hope is illegitimate," the sheriff said, a flicker of excitement in his eyes, "then the McLennans' will is void. The fortune doesn't go to her. It goes to the next of kin. And you know who that is?" Nora shook her head. "Eliza had a cousin," Miller said. "A quiet woman named Sarah who the family disowned years ago for marrying a poor farmer. She lives 2 counties over. She has no idea she's about to become one of the wealthiest women in the territory." A plan began to form, audacious and dangerous. "If we can find her," Nora breathed. "If we can get her to make a legal claim." "It would completely undermine Silas and the McLennans," Miller finished. "It would take away their entire motivation. The fortune would be out of their reach." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. It meant leaving the safety of the ranch, traveling through hostile territory, and finding a woman who might not even want to be found. And all the while, Silas would be hunting them. But it was the only move they had left. "All right, Sheriff," Nora said, her decision made. "Let's go on the offensive." As she turned to go back inside and tell Kane the news, a glint of metal in the dirt near the porch caught her eye. She bent down and picked it up. It was a small, ornate silver button, the kind you'd find on a fancy waistcoat. But it wasn't the silver that made her blood run cold. It was the engraving on it. A small, almost imperceptible symbol. A serpent swallowing a feather. It must have fallen off one of Silas's men during the fight. But then Nora remembered something. Sheriff Miller. When he had first arrived, he'd been wearing a waistcoat under his duster. He'd taken it off in the heat of his conversation with her, draping it over his saddle. She had been so focused on the threat, she hadn't paid it any mind. Now, a horrifying suspicion began to creep into her mind. She looked at the button in her hand. Then she looked up at the sheriff, who was smiling at her, a confident, reassuring smile. But was it reassurance? Or was it the smile of a predator who had just successfully infiltrated the henhouse? Was Sheriff Miller really trying to help them? Or had he just played her? Was his entire story, the warning, the plan to find the cousin, just an elaborate trick to gain her trust, to get her to lower her guard and lead him right to the one thing that could seal Kane's fate? The evidence, the truth. Nora's hand closed around the silver button, the sharp edges digging into her palm. She was standing on a battlefield, surrounded by lies. And she had just realized she might have put her trust in the most dangerous enemy of all. If you enjoyed this story, Don't forget to subscribe.